Selling a home is easy, right? Stick with us here and we'll tell you some stories that might make you a little concerned.
You better get fired up.
I am fired up. How are you doing, Lissette?
I'm fired up, Joe. How are you?
What I'm talking about. I'm great, man. I'm great. We've got beautiful weather out right now. The market is, I'm seeing a lot of new listings come on. We're getting a lot of new listings. So that's good to see some movement. But what we're seeing a lot now is people who are thinking about selling their homes themselves. And obviously, the big pro to that is you're going to save a lot of money in a commission, right? Now, just to kind of get into it, one thing I want to throw out there is when you pay a typical commission, that commission is split in half, right? You're paying your listing agent for all the marketing and the negotiation skills and the time and the open houses and the paperwork and everything else. But the other half goes to attract, it's a marketing piece, a carrot, to attract that buyer's agent. So I think a lot of people think, hey, if I don't list my house, I'm going to get out of a commission. That means you got to find the buyer yourself, which is pretty dang challenging, especially if you're not a realtor. And especially if you're not really welcoming any buyer's agents, right? So it can be really challenging. So you can save a half a commission, right? And then you can put it on and you can pay out a buyer's agent's commission and you're saving half. But there are a lot of other challenges that pop up when you're not represented. So what I want to do today is not scare anybody. That's not the goal. If you want to sell it yourself, I always tell friends and family, you want to sell it yourself, go nuts. I'll answer all of your easy questions. I'm not going to answer a half an hour long question, but I'll answer your easy questions for free. And it goes for anybody listening. I'm happy to help you. Go do it, right? But you're going to get yourself into binds that a lot of times it's challenging to get you out of. So today, we're going to talk about some of those typical issues that can pop up as a seller that can be challenging to get through in the middle of a transaction. So Lissette, why don't you kick us off? Tell us one thing that a seller might want to think about when it comes to a deal falling apart through the transaction.
I think it goes right to one of the first steps we should all do when we're thinking of selling our property is take a look at our own home. Maybe take into consideration some of the things that we should be working on that maybe we need to improve. What is the condition of our home? And that's why it's really important to have an expert on your side that can bring in these home inspectors, or they could give you the perspective of the buyer that they've seen that might cause an issue down the road. You as a homeowner, you love your property. You have an emotional attachment. So maybe you think your black splash is beautiful, but maybe it's just really dark and it's turning buyers away. But you don't see that. But having an expert on your side that can point that out and say, take that into consideration when you're pricing the home too and when you're marketing. That's just one of the things that comes to mind is just overall property condition.
I love that. And I'll share one with you again, sticking to kind of the beginning of the whole experience is that offer. And a lot of times you need to know as a listing agent what the offer looks like and all the pros and cons of that offer. What outs does that buyer have? Because you want to protect yourself. You don't want to give them that many outs. You also want to see a pre-approval letter from a lender. And there's a difference between the pre-approval letters that you're going to see and what that lender has done, what that buyer has provided. And for you as a seller, being able to see those differences and ask the lender the right questions to, again, protect yourself, right? And then the last thing up front with that offer is your proof of funds. Do you even have the money to do this? And do you as a seller know how much money they need? A lot of times people think, well, it's FHA. It says they need 3.5% down. They need 3.5. No, they need 3.5 plus they need 3.5 to 4.5 for closing costs, right? If they're a VA buyer, they're going to have a funding fee. How much is the funding fee? So there's a lot of things that you're going to want to know about when it comes to the numbers to ensure that they've got it in proof of funds. And that brings up another thing, right? Looking at proof of funds that you can actually buy into. I'll give you a couple examples of proof of funds I did not accept. I had, let's say, Joe and Lissette Anderson are on a contract, right? And all of a sudden you get the proof of funds and it's from Bob Anderson. Well, who's Bob? Well, Bob's Joe's dad. Okay, great. Well, Bob's not on the contract, so I can't legally hold Bob to any consequences if he doesn't pony up the cash. He can hold his cash back and I have no recourse, right? So really knowing how to look at these things and analyze them is incredibly important. Lissette, what else are you seeing that might cause a deal to fall through?
I think it goes also just hand in hand with the contract, understanding that contract, understanding what contingencies the buyer has and what deadlines that they have to meet or any deadlines you have to meet as well. If you're not aware of that and maybe you're passing by those deadlines and passing by those contingencies, one, you could fall out of the contract, or two, you're not securing that the buyer is actually meeting their end of the deal and you're actually going to get to the closing table. Having again a professional and expert on your side, we have those time frames listed, constantly taking a look at them, checking all the boxes, making sure that the other side is getting done what they need to get done in a timely manner so we can get to the closing table and secure your deal.
Yeah, and really knowing what you can hold the buyer's feet to the fire with is important too. Knowing when all of those contingencies come up, the loan approval, the inspection, the appraisal, the survey, all of it, and then being able to reach out to that person or their representative that day or the day before, 2 days before, and say, "Hey, how are we looking on this thing?" Most sellers aren't going to know that until it's too late and it's an issue, right? So great points on that. Another one, and probably the biggest issue that we have mid-transaction, is going to be the inspection period, right? And that's where a really good agent's value is going to shine. A lot of sellers have the mindset of, this is how my house is coming. I'm not fixing anything. So get out of here with that. I'm not negotiating. That's a great attitude if you want a deal to fall apart, right? Now, that doesn't mean you need to give up 5, 10 grand every time you have an inspection on a home that you're selling. There is a savvy, intelligent, logical way to support with data what it is you'd be offering to do as a seller, right? And the same is true with a buyer. We set our buyers up for success by presenting what they want in a specific way that gets us more than normal. So right there, you should be getting a lot of value out of your agent. If you don't have that, again, I think people oversell themselves on how good they are at negotiating, because I'll tell you from experience, and Lissette, tell me if I'm wrong, when I deal directly with a buyer or a seller who is not represented, I would say 90, 95% of them do exactly the same things, say exactly the same things, try to negotiate in exactly the same way. And a lot of them think that, hardballing is the way to get the deal done. And in all honesty, it's probably the most challenging way to get things done. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, most definitely. And you also take the emotional side out
Mm,
of it when you have
yes.
someone representing you in the transaction that can negotiate for you and also make a level-headed discussion on both sides so everyone comes to terms and hopefully a meeting place in the middle.
Yeah. So let's talk about two more points of contention, which are the appraisal and the survey. Anytime you're going to get a house funded, right? It's not being paid for with cash. They require an appraisal to be done if it hasn't been done within a certain amount of time. I think it's a year or two, something like that. So you got to get an appraisal. Well, what happens if that appraisal is over? What happens if that appraisal is under? I'm going to give you the over first because it's a little bit simpler. If you're paying 500 grand for a home, appraisal comes in at 510, that is not a problem. Unless you tell the seller, "Hey seller, it appraised at 510." Now a lot of sellers are thinking, I undersold my home. I want that 10 grand. If you don't give it to me, I'm backing out. Now, does that make any sense legally or contractually? No. But does it matter? Nope, because they can make it a pain in the butt for you. So it's important to have a realtor who knows not to share that. So if you're a buyer, if you're a seller and you ask, "Hey, what did it appraised for?" Any intelligent lender, any intelligent buyer's agent is going to say, "It appraised." And that's it. What did it appraise for? Not sure, but it appraised. We're good. And that's the end of the conversation. Listing agents know why you're not sharing that, right? It's not in your best interest. So they always say it appraised. Here's another thing. You might be saying, well, they can't legally back out. I can sue them for specific for performance. Let's say you know that. Okay, cool. But what happens when all of a sudden there's something to negotiate on that happens after the appraisal, right? Maybe there's a roof that is leaking, or somebody backs their pickup truck into the garage door or whatever. Someone might be a little bit more difficult to negotiate with and compromise with if they know that your appraisal came in high and they think you're getting a deal on their house. So again, holding that back is imperative. Now, when you go to the short side, it's a little bit different. You've always got 4 options as a buyer, right? You can increase the amount of cash you're bringing to the table. The seller can drop their price, a mixture of those two, or the deal falls apart. Well, I'll tell you, in a lot of cases where there's an unrepresented side, a lot of times emotions and ego can get involved and the deal falls apart right there. I'll tell you from my experience, I've had 13 fall short since I've sold homes here in Port St. Lucie. And of those 13, 12 of them sold. And the one that did not sell, it fell apart. We put it on the market. We got exactly the same price within a week of putting it back on the market. And it sold 30 days later because a new appraisal came in and it was just fine. But a lot of people who don't have that experience don't know how to have that conversation without the emotion, don't know how to get people successfully to keep on moving forward with it. So again, the appraisal is a big deal. Survey, you can have issues where you've got easements or you've got encroachments. An easement is, okay, Lissette and I are neighbors, and maybe she's behind me, right? The road's right here, then it's my lot right up against the road, and then she's behind me. So there's a road going over my lot back to her lot, and she needs that driveway to get to her property. Well, I own the driveway, but she would have a legal easement over that portion of my property in efforts to get back there. A lot of people here locally in Port St. Lucie will have shared driveways, right? You could have power lines or sewer or water or whatever it is that'll create an easement as well, right? An encroachment is I'll make myself the bad guy here, Lissette. I built my garage 2 feet over onto Lisette's property, right? And maybe Lisette's fine with it. Maybe she doesn't know about it until I'm going to go to close, or she's going to go to close, and now it becomes an issue. And I've seen that before. How do you negotiate through that? How do you help that person who's got the encroachment on their property? How do you help the person who accidentally put their, property, whether it's a fence or a shed or a garage, over? How do you walk through that? It's very complex. It's very challenging, and it takes experience to keep that deal together and make everybody feel like they're winning in the process. Lissette, what else you got?
I think also going back to the negotiation and the timeline is making sure from the beginning you just price the property right and you understand the market conditions and the comparable properties to your property. Having that knowledge and that expertise can really set the tone for the transaction and also for the seller's timeline. I mean, sellers have either they want to get into another property, they want to move out of state or to another town, and they have a specific timeline. Well, what's one of the best ways to try to manage that a little bit is pricing the property right, and having someone that has that knowledge can do that for you. When sellers try to do it on their own, a lot of times they find themselves that they overprice the property, and that affects their property timeline. They're sitting on the market for much longer than expected.
Yeah, and I'm sure, Lissette, you'll agree with me. When I sit down with people and we talk about pricing a property, it usually comes down to something like, hey, Zillow said it's worth this, which Zillow's a robot, man. Like, they don't see the inside of your home. They don't know the condition, good or bad. They don't know your upgrades. They don't know a lot of things. In fact, I saw one the other day, didn't know the people put a pool in. They were ready to sell their home for the value of their home minus a pool, even though they put a pool in. So Zillow is famously inaccurate on prices, both to the high side and the low side. You're either losing money or you're not selling. It's a problem either way. Or it's, hey, my neighbor 12 months ago sold a 2-story home when I got a 1-story home, and his has a pool and I don't, and his is updated, mine isn't, or whatever it is. But he sold it for $600. So mine is better. It's got to be worth $625. Well, that's an incredibly loosely based piece of data there. And we don't just want to look at his house. We want to look at all the houses, and maybe we can find newer comps that sold in the last 3 to 6 months. Maybe we can find 1-stories instead of 2-stories. Maybe we can find, homes without pools because we don't have a pool. Wouldn't that be important? So being able to look at that is critical, and it's going to give you that more accurate depiction of your value. So I would guess if you looked at for sale by owners and you compared their prices to what an agent is going to price it at, it's going to be off by 5, 10, 15%. Almost always overpriced. Almost always. Here's a couple other things. Buyer spends their cash. Let's say I'm going to buy your home and it's a $500,000 home. I'm doing a 3.5 down FHA. That's what, 17.5. And then I need another, let's say 17.5 in closing costs. That's 35 grand. And I show you on day one proof of funds. Well, what happens if I go out and I buy a $30,000 RV and now all I got left in my bank account is 5 grand? What recourse do you have as a seller? You do have recourse, but you got to know what it is, how to legally talk your way through it. And it's not just, am I legally going to win? It's having the conversation with the person that takes as much emotion out of it and is as logical as possible and is as legally accurate as possible in getting them to move forward in what it is you want, right? Here's another one. What happens if the buyer loses their job or dies? That can be challenging as well, right? Knowing your rights, knowing the contract is really going to help you. What happens if I'm going to sell my house and a buyer comes and gives me an offer? So now I put an offer in on the house that I'm going to go live in with my family. And all of a sudden, we're about 3, 4, 5 days before closing, and that seller says, we changed our minds. We're going to back out. We don't want to sell to you anymore. We're going to stay here. Holy smokes. Now what do? I'm about to be homeless, and I got a family of 4 here. That's another challenge, right? Now, there are a lot of options in that scenario, some that are going to be really nice, some that aren't going to be so nice. But knowing all those options and having a professional logically present them to you along with the pros and cons is incredibly helpful. I'll give you 2 more. What happens if an issue pops up between the time you get the inspection done and closing? Who's responsible for that? And whoever it is, to what extent are they responsible for getting it done? And what if the buyer and seller both agree, hey, it's not a big deal, don't worry about it, but the lender says absolutely not, that absolutely has to be done, or we're not going to fund the loan? Whose job is it to get it done, and where in the contract does it state that? That's going to be important to know, right? And here's the last one. And Lissette, I'm guessing you've got some experience with this too. Final walkthroughs, right? Both on the buy and the sell side. There's very explicit language in the contract that states exactly what needs to happen at the time of close. You do a final walkthrough either the morning of or the night before. And the whole reason you do the final walkthrough is to see, is the home in the same condition it was in or better than the time of the offer, plus whatever we agreed to in the inspection, right? If they were going to fix the roof or whatever it was, is it in that condition or not? I've shown up a lot of times as a buyer's agent and nothing's cleaned out of the house, or 80%'s cleaned out of the house, and you still got some stuff in there. That's a problem. What legal recourse do we have? What motivators can we put in place to get the seller to get that stuff out? What if you're the seller? Because that's what this video is about. Buyer shows up and they say, I want this place spick and span. I see dust over here. I see, a little stain on the tile floor, whatever it is. Do they legally have the right to say that, right? Do they legally have the right to come after you or force you to do something? Again, this is where there's so many situations where a professional agent is going to save you thousands of dollars because they can tell you legally what you have to do, and then they can give you a recommendation based on the legalities of that. Lissette, what else you got? I'm out, man. So if you've got any extras, these are all bonuses at this point.
I mean, we see so many things throughout all transactions. There's rarely a transaction that we don't have an issue, something comes up. But that's why it's so beneficial having an agent on your side, because we've seen so many of these issues pop up. We're ready to pop up and find a solution for that problem. And if we can't find it, we know someone that could probably come across and step into the transaction and solve it for us as well. So that's the benefit of having an expert, a market leader on your end.
Yeah, 100%. Guys, I appreciate you joining us, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook. Thank you so much for all the support. If you've got any ideas for future videos, feel free to leave them in the comments, and we will absolutely get that to that in the future. Thank you. And Lissette, I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks,